welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, D. Reiser.
Hey, Reiser.
Today, we're going to be talking about the Bone Wars. Now, my last episode that I did, Tony, was the Emu Wars, and I realize we're moving on to another war-based topic with another delightful name.
I did the Roar Wars last week.
The Roar Wars?
Roar Wars.
The Rural Juror. So this is one, I believe you actually took a crack at trying to get an episode out of this one and sort of fell by the wayside. I persisted, man. I ordered some books. I am excited to talk to you this week about dinosaur bones and two guys who really hated each other about how many dinosaur bones that they got.
It's weird whenever scientists just can't get along.
That is one of the main features of this story, especially towards the end. And the two scientists in question are two guys named Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh.
I feel like Drinker Cope is a great name if you're trying to quit alcohol.
Well, it's his middle name too, which is kind of weird. It's like Cope you're just born with. If you're Drinker, like your dad definitely did give you that name on purpose for some reason.
I'm just going to give my kids middle name like Runner and Producer and Director and see what happens.
Okay. Well, Cope did not actually turn into a drinker. In fact, he was a fairly religious man. He was born in a Quaker family in the 1800s, and early on in his childhood, he showed an aptitude for what was called at the time natural philosophy. He wandered around the grounds of his family farm, sort of just studying nature, really being interested in the things that he could find, and he was a very gifted dude. I mean, at age 19, he publishes his first scientific paper, and then he goes to the University of Pennsylvania and he studies under Joseph Leidy, or Leidy? I'm not exactly sure how I'm supposed to pronounce this name, but Leidy is the person who's going to set Cope on the course that he ends up on. Leidy is the father of American paleontology, and at the time Cope studies under him, really not anybody else is doing much with paleontology. Leidy kind of sits at the university and people know that he's interested in bones, so they just find bones and send them to him, and he studies them and makes discoveries. And for a while, Leidy has the corner on the American market on paleontology, but thanks to Edward Cope and his friend, that's going to change. Marsh is our second character in this story. His full name, as I mentioned earlier, Othniel Charles Marsh, was not a name that he liked that much. He tried to shorten it to OC, and he also gets several bad nicknames over the course of his life. He's kind of the opposite of Cope. He goes to college later than everybody else, and because he's older than all the other kids there, they end up calling him Captain, kind of as sort of a mockery of like the fact that he's the oldest guy there. Both of these guys are relatively well-funded personally, at least at first. Edward Drinker Cope, his dad is what was called at the time a gentleman farmer, which as far as I can tell just means that he owned a farm that he didn't really have to do that much personally with. He kind of just oversaw it, told other people what to do and how to do it, and they went out and did it. And it was really expected that Cope himself would follow in those footsteps. Othniel Charles Marsh, on the other hand, while not personally wealthy through his father, had a tremendously rich uncle. Just insanely rich. So both of these guys, from the beginning, are going to come at this endeavor that they're both going to be competing in with quite a bit of funding. Cope and Marsh both went to Europe during the Civil War, probably to avoid sort of the unpleasantness, not wanting to fight, not wanting to get shot, not wanting to get picked up in it. Especially you can understand Cope because he's a Quaker, probably not cool with the fighting. And they go over there and they're both studying independently, and they actually meet each other. They meet each other there, and because they're both pretty interested in paleontology, they hit it off relatively well to start with. They exchange correspondence over several years as they're in Europe. They both named dinosaurs after each other, and things seem pretty rosy for Cope and Marsh. Cope and Marsh maybe, gonna team up and take on the world and both be a great co-team of paleontologists discovering things in the United States.
So what went wrong?
Well, let me tell you, Tony. They do return to the United States. Cope first in 1864, followed by Marsh in 1866. And both men take up unpaid professorships. And both of these positions are essentially bought for them. Cope's position was at Haverford College, where his father had donated quite a bit of money. And Marsh's position was at Yale, where his uncle donated enough money to create an entire section for paleontology within the university. So Yale's like, yeah, your uncle gave us so much money, and you can be in charge of this thing that he just built for us now.
It's like that old saying, some people earn success, and other people are given it as a graduation present.
Yes, it's also really telling that sort of in the current events of today, this is very much the more things change, the more they stay the same. You can still buy a degree at Yale. However, despite the fact that Cope has this professorship where he's teaching paleontology to other students, he's actually not that interested in the teaching side of things. He mostly just wants to study dinosaurs, and he wants to do it in the raw. He wants to dig these bones up and actually get his hands on them instead of studying what other people have done or maybe getting people to send him stuff like Leidy did. So he goes on the road to look for bones. And at this time, right, but by sort of the late 1860s, Cope had published an astonishing 37 scientific papers. And since we're going to be talking about a competition between Cope and Marsh, I should point out, at this point, Marsh had published 2.
That's a little disparity.
This is actually going to be a big feature of their competition. Cope is just constantly churning out new work at a speed that doesn't allow him to check it very closely. And Marsh is going to be the more plodding, methodical, slow, but very much like when he puts something out, he's going to make sure that it's right. So there's a quantity versus quality thing that's already cropping up here, and this might be sort of the root of the problem that these men ended up having with each other. Things really started to go bad between Cope and Marsh when Cope took Marsh to see the marl pits in New Jersey, where he had made his very first significant discovery. This is also where Cope's mentor, Joseph Leidy, had done a lot of his digging when he was doing anything personally. He was digging in these marl pits in New Jersey, and Marsh, upon seeing this repository of fossils, after Cope leaves, Cope shows him everything. Marsh says, wow, this is great. Thanks for showing me this. It's so exciting. Why don't you go and, I don't know, buy a hamburger or something? I don't know if they had hamburgers at the time. He waits.
Well, cheeseburgers were invented close to where they were at in Colorado.
Well, they're not in Colorado yet. They're still in New Jersey, sadly. Marsh waits for Cope to leave, and then he goes to the person who runs this pit. And on the down low, he says, hey, man, I got a lot of money, and I want you to send me all your fossils. Because how this worked at the time was that mostly paleontologists weren't personally digging up fossils. It was a lot of work that was essentially contracted out to the lower skilled people, and you would just collect the fossils that other people had dug up, and then you would figure out what was going on with the bones, put them together, make your suppositions about what the animal looked like. And so Marsh is essentially cutting Cope off at the knees. This is their most significant source of fossils at the time, is this marl pit in New Jersey, and Marsh is just sucking all of the fossils up now.
I could definitely see how that would cause a problem.
It gets worse, though. Cope had put together a skeleton of a thing that he had excavated, and he had published this finding in one of the prestigious scientific journals of the day. And after he published the finding, Marsh pipes up and he says, You got the head on the wrong end there. That's the tail. You've got the head on the tail. That's not the neck. That's the tail. You're dumb. Hey, Cope. You've got the head the wrong way around. And Cope is just mortified. He's embarrassed. He's like, oh no, I made this terrible mistake. This is never, by the way, it never does leave him. Marsh will never, ever miss an opportunity to bring this up. Cope tries to cover his tracks. He does the quick, delete the tweet. It's trending in a bad way kind of thing. And he tries to buy up all the copies of the publication where the mistake was made. And Marsh, in just like a really devious kind of way, goes to him and says, here's my copy that I bought. And then goes and buys 2 more copies to keep under his mattress just in case he needs them for the future to prove that Cope did in fact put the head on the wrong end of the dinosaur.
I want that to be an expression for everyday life.
What,
put
head
the
on
head
the
on
wrong
the
end?
wrong end of the dinosaur. Yeah.
But the real Bone Wars got kicked off as both men became interested in the newly uncovered fossil deposits in the American West. You'll recall that it's not too long before this that Lewis and Clark had headed out and started to map basically what was unknown to the white people at the time and found just huge amounts of land, and people were only just now starting to trickle out into this area, and they uncover in Colorado and Kansas and Wyoming these huge fossil beds that contain bones unlike anything anybody has ever seen. And these 2 guys naturally are just on the next train out. I mean, they've just built the train rails. They build the train rails. In the process of building the train rails, they find the fossils, and these guys get on these shiny new train rails and head west as fast as they can go. Marsh makes it out there first, and he starts digging in the bone fields of Kansas. And despite a lot of dangers and really interesting adventures, he does a great job of uncovering a lot of fossils. There's a whole sort of set of adventures that Marsh spins up here into maybe more than they actually were at the time, but it's still an interesting story where you've got the American Indians out west who are still very dangerous and not happy that people are building rails on what they see as their land, and you have a lot of wild animals. And so this guy's going out into buffalo country. He's dealing with the Indians. He's meeting up with soldiers and facing all kinds of dangers, and all of this to be able to dig up fossils. Cope sees how well Marsh is doing out west, and he gets interested himself, naturally. He goes out west as well, and he funds the money using his inheritance. Now, despite the fact that Cope is more personally wealthy than Marsh, he also has more limits, so this is actually more of a sacrifice for him. Marsh is kind of going on Yale's ticket, where they're sending him out as their official paleontologist, whereas Cope is essentially spending his own money on this, and he doesn't have an unlimited amount. So he uses this money from his inheritance, and when he goes out west, he's interested in digging up bones, and he goes to the exact spot where Marsh had already dug up a bunch of bones. Now, you'll remember that Marsh was horning in on his action in these marl pits, so there's a little bit of turnabout is fair play here, but Marsh did not see it that way. Marsh thought of this territory as his bone territory. Now, there's no legal stake that he has on any of this land. He doesn't own it, right? He hasn't bought it. He's just dug up there some bones, and he thinks of it as the place that he digs bones. And now here comes this dumb Quaker upstart Cope, who's published 37 stupid papers and put the head on the wrong place, and he's digging up in the same pits that Marsh was digging on? No way. Marsh is not having it.
I really wonder if there are territory rules for that now with science, like if you can just go to the same place where somebody else is, or if you get like a permit for an area. Did they ever figure that out?
I've heard recently that essentially, since it's a lot of places that are private property, you have to get permission from the owners of the property to dig, which has turned into some interesting problems lately as fossils have gotten more financially valuable. So previously, fossils were mostly just academically interesting, but as people have become interested in dinosaurs to a much, much greater degree since the 90s, if you have a relatively complete Tyrannosaurus skeleton, that can sell for millions of dollars, and people have gotten in conflicts between scientists and property owners, and the property owners want to get in on some of that money that they could make selling the bones, and it's still kind of a mess sometimes.
Yeah, like, as much as I love the scientific community, if I had a chance at making $2 million for something in my backyard, I'd be pretty conflicted.
But if you'd already given them permission to dig on the land and to get the fossils, you can see where the weirdness comes in.
Yep.
So Marsh is really angry about this, and he starts sending men to spy on Cope, and then personally heads back out west to thwart Cope. So he'd been out there sort of on a one-time trip, had dug up a bunch of bones, goes back to Yale, he's putting bones together, gets word that Cope is out there in his territory, and he's like on the next train going to stop him. At one point, he plants bones at a site where he knows Cope is going to dig in order to trick this guy into making a fake publication about a dinosaur that doesn't actually exist. Or it might not have been a dinosaur. They're actually a lot more interested in mammals, especially early in their careers. Dinosaurs come into this later. But he's doing everything he can to upend what Cope is doing. And in the meantime, right, while he's trying to stop Cope from digging up stuff, he manages to talk the people who are working for Cope into sending him the fossils that they had originally promised that they would send to Cope. So he's stealing fossils out from under Cope again. Right? Like, Cope just went to his place. Cope just went to his spot where he had dug, and he's like, I'll dig here too. Maybe I'll find some bones too. He's digging stuff up. Marsh is once again on the down low, scooping bones out from underneath of Cope that had, by rights, should have gone to Cope. Cope goes back home in 1872, basically having exhausted all of his money and his energy, and he starts getting in this letter war with Marsh. Both men also continuing publishing papers with, again, as we mentioned earlier, Cope going much, much faster than Marsh. In some cases, he puts a skeleton together, figures out that it could be a new species, and sends off a telegram to the scientific publications of the day to mark his discovery of this so that he will not lose time in marking new discoveries of new animals.
Sounds like he was just very, very organized and a little bit of a glory hunter, but he knew what he was doing.
Well, Cope, as I mentioned, is actually less organized. He's making a lot more mistakes than Marsh. Marsh is also publishing papers, but he's taking his time, he's slow, he's methodical, he's checking his work, and in the Wikipedia article that I read as part of my research for this, it mentioned at one point Cope had published 30 papers and Marsh had published much fewer than that. But all of Cope's papers had misidentified the animals that they were supposed to be about. So literally,
every single one.
All the work that he did was just a swing and a miss.
That's bad.
Yep, Cope, you gotta slow down, man. Marsh is understandably annoyed by this rapid-fire approach that Cope is taking, because the way that getting to name an animal works is, if you're the first, you're the one, right? Like, you got it, and especially at this time, right, maybe you would have different scientists in different places, and, one guy finds something, but another guy finds it, and the first person to actually publish the description of the animal gets to name it. And this is very important to these guys. At this point, they're very much keeping score on who's doing more bones and naming more new animals, and Marsh is falling behind. At least it looks like he's falling behind, because Cope is just rapid fire putting these papers out. And at one point, they're so close to naming the same animal at the same time that they both publish papers describing the same specimen on the same day, which is just something that hadn't, nobody who set up these rules about who gets to name what animals ever thought about the idea that it would become so close and so competitive that people would be rushing to publish and putting things out literally on the same day. There was no rule for figuring out who would get the naming rights. Cope said that he should have because he wrote a longer paper, and I actually don't know how that argument ended up landing, Tony.
It's not the length, it's how good it is.
As these guys develop a greater and greater appetite for fossils, sadly, Cope's mentor is kind of caught in the crossfire. You'll remember Joseph Leidy was just having people send him fossils, and it was kind of a low-key thing where, again, people knew Leidy liked fossils. Leidy was like, yeah, sure, I'll look at them, and he would look at them. Cope and Marsh, though, because of their cutthroat tactics and paying people off and just absolutely dominating this market for fossils, push Leidy out. Leidy has to go to study entomology because there's just not fossils for him to study anymore because these two guys are sucking them all up. Marsh went back west in 1873, but this expedition would be his last. After this point, he would basically just hire people out to work in these digs. As I mentioned earlier, it wasn't really considered necessary for the paleontologist himself to be on site. So he would just get big shipments of bones and figure them out back at Yale. Now, until this point, dinosaurs weren't actually part of the picture. But as Marsh is heading out for his final Western expedition, the people digging the railroads discover bones on a scale that nobody had ever imagined before. These are bones that are so large that the initial theory that they have is that they're whale bones. These are just massive things, and nobody has any idea what's going on with these huge animals. And so you can imagine Cope and Marsh have been sort of uncovering various versions of animals that maybe already are around, or, I think Cope does some important work with early horses. Now, the interesting thing about this is the guy who first discovers these bones, named Arthur Lakes, he writes to both men. He actually writes to Marsh first, and then he ends up sending a letter to Cope as well. He's like, hey guys, I found some bones, thought you might be interested. And Marsh is back, as I meant, this is before Marsh is actually headed west. He's back at Yale sort of doing his studies, and Cope jumps on the opportunity. Cope is out there like a shot as soon as he can on site digging up bones, and Marsh ends up playing pickup. He's fallen behind. He's digging for what he can. And on top of that, he actually has the mine where he's digging for these dinosaur bones collapse. So he's suffered two blows. On the first count, he wasn't first on the scene. On the second count, the mine that he did get going to start getting some bones out ends up falling apart, and his guys are sort of out of work for a little bit. But almost immediately after this, another dinosaur fossil bed was uncovered, and Marsh sends his guys out right away. He's not going to make the same mistake he made the first time where he's like, I don't know, maybe I'll wait and see. He doesn't want Cope to get there first. He sends his guys out, basically still covered in dust from the original mine collapse. One guy gets back into Kansas City on the train and gets a telegram immediately sending him back out to where this new discovery is. And at the same time, he sends his agents to bribe the men working for Cope to send the fossils that he uncovers and his digs to Marsh. He's still trying this trick over and over. It keeps working. I guess it's working for him, but he keeps stealing fossils directly out from under Cope.
It's so shady to just keep doing it.
The worst part is there's a certain point in this story where Cope ends up with some fossils that actually, at least he thinks, should belong to Marsh, and he just sends them on. He's like, I found some fossils that should have been yours. Here you go. And
he's just trying to be the nice guy about it?
Yeah.
That's so weird.
He's not so much of a nice guy that he's not, at this point, actively battling Marsh. Both men, at this point, start dynamiting the sites where they're digging after they're done digging, just so that the other guy can't come in and make any more findings.
So, possibly breaking a bunch of fossils and everything else, just out of spite.
Yeah, you know what? Those fossils, at least they're not going to be anybody else's fossils.
Yep.
And they also harassed each other by any means necessary. I read one account where there was actually a stone throwing fight between these two, where they're literally throwing rocks at each other, the two workforces for Cope and Marsh. The two men slammed each other in the press, mostly in academic journals, although that'll change in a little bit. They send spies to each other's dig sites, and this really just sort of envelops everything that they're doing. There was a great quote that I'm just going to read directly as it was written from a book called The Bone Hunter's Revenge, Dinosaurs' Greed, and the Greatest Scientific Feud of the Gilded Age by David Rains Wallace. And he wrote, quote, "Rivalry had begun to overshadow the paleontology that had initiated it, and acquire a life of its own. Competition has a way of devouring any real interest in matters apart from itself, and dinosaurs came to seem almost beside the point." End quote. To make matters even worse, unrest broke out even among the men who were working for the same side. Marsh, because he's managing a lot of this stuff from afar, doesn't have a good handle on what the men on the ground are dealing with or how they've had their setup structured. So at one point, Marsh's head man steps down and he appoints somebody new to be in charge of the dig. But then Marsh also hears that he stepped down and appoints somebody else. And these two guys almost end up getting in a pistol fight.
It's like the stakes are being raised.
Meanwhile, Marsh, far removed from the realities of bone digging, managed to get himself appointed as the head of the newly united United States Geological Survey. Now, before this point, there were a lot of individual geological surveys for different regions, and Cope, because he's running low on funds, he can't go out on his own with a party to protect him and with a bunch of people to dig. So what he ends up doing is attaching himself to these local regional geological surveys. But Marsh, in becoming the head of the United States Geological Survey, as they put all these different surveys together, cuts Cope off from this avenue of being able to dig for bones. He says, "Nah, we're not going to have any civilians tagging along with our important geological research." Now, at the same time, Marsh himself is doing great because on the one hand, he's got his Yale money that is still coming in so that he can study dinosaurs, and now he's also got money coming in from the United States government. And he has control of the USGS survey, so he can have those guys sending him back bones, and the people that he has on his payroll figuring out the bones. Although I do want to point out, despite the fact that Marsh has access to this money, I read several accounts of the fact that he was terrible about paying his people on time. All he had to do was just submit, like, the form to the United States government for some of his guys to get paid, and he couldn't even manage to do that on a regular basis. It was just whenever he was done digging up or putting together bones, when he didn't have anything better going on, I was like, I guess I'll sign this requisition form. You can get some money so your kids can eat or whatever. I'm so depressed I don't have any dinosaur bones to put together right now. Forms are lame.
I'm just imagining, like, it's the government not paying somebody. Or not paying them on time. Imagine that.
Well, it's not the government's fault here. I mean, well, to be fair,
He's
it's
part of the
Marsh's working for the government, but like they would have paid him if he just filed the dang paperwork. As a final straw in this fight between Cope and Marsh, Marsh decides that he's going to use his power as an agent of the government to change the law such that any fossils that had been collected previously by anyone accompanying a geological survey would have to be donated to the government. And you know who that applies to. You know who was collecting fossils during geological surveys that he was not, like, being paid for, by the way. Cope is just sort of riding along, you know, for protection, essentially. Cope has all of these fossils that he's dug up during these surveys, and Marsh is trying to get his hands on those. The stuff that's already in his possession, he's going to seize by law. Fortunately, Cope has a reasonably good defense against this. He mounts his defense legally. He shows that he has properly accounted for all of these bones that he dug up. He has papers where he's signed for them and receipts where he's paid for the proper fees and things. And Marsh doesn't get his hands on the bones. But now Cope is just done. He's in a rough spot personally anyway. Like, he's run low on money. With the money that he did have left, he invested in a silver mine thinking that, you know, I'm a geologist. I know about geology. How could this go? I'm broke now. So he's in a real bad place. Marsh is trying to take basically the only thing left that he has, which is his large collection of bones. And so Cope unleashes the mother lode. Cope has been keeping records of every nasty thing that Marsh has done throughout their entire feud of 20 years. And he gets on the horn with the newspapers and says, hey, you guys want some dirt on a high-ranking government official who's done some real shady business? And surprisingly, the newspapers were like, yeah, we do. We want that dirt, boy. And Cope puts it all out there. He just unleashes everything that he has on Marsh, from like big indiscretions that Marsh has committed and spying and all the little lies that he thinks he's told, into minutia of things that Cope thinks that Marsh has wrong about paleontology that nobody reasonably cares about. But, you know, they're both paleontologists, so you kind of just get lost in nerdland there. And he opens this floodgate, and the thing is, Marsh doesn't sit still for it. Marsh comes back hitting hard, and Marsh says, oh yeah? Well, guess what? You made a lot of mistakes because you're super speedy, and by the way, head on the wrong end, my dude. And
always head on the wrong end.
And he makes it sound like it's a new mistake, too. Like, Marsh spins this, like, and just very recently, Mr. Cope has made a foolish mistake, and I have 2 copies of the paper where he published the head on the wrong end. It's not a new thing, obviously. Like, he's been poking Cope about this in sort of the naturalist journals for years and years, but now it's in the big papers. And everybody's just kind of annoyed with these two at this point. The rest of the scientific community, they sort of have sides, right? Like they've all kind of decided who they like better, and Marsh has guys on his side and Cope has guys on his side, but they don't want to be dragged into the spotlight like this. And when they start unloading on each other, they start quoting their colleagues who are in support of them, and their colleagues are like, man, I didn't want to be in the tabloid when I said I liked you and I didn't like the other guy. Like, can we just not? So they're burning through all of their goodwill that they have, even within the paleontology community.
I mean, it does seem like it's just like drama after drama after drama. Like, I imagine scientists just got bored of it real quick.
Well, the thing is, they knew about these guys, right? Like, they had been squabbling sort of on the down low for about 20 years. So the scientists understood that there was this feud going on, but when it blows up, they don't want to be involved in the explosion. They don't want to get hit by shrapnel. They were fine when it was sort of professional squabbling within the community, but once it breaks out and it's in sort of major newspapers and part of the big political discussion of the day, they're just done. Now, Cope is pretty bad off. Near the end of our story in 1890, he's had to sell his house, his wife has left him, and he's holed up in an apartment with nothing more than his fossils to keep him company, essentially. On top of this, he's in relatively poor health. He had managed to get some teaching positions for a while that kept him in some money, but he ends up not being healthy enough to stick with those. And also near the end of this war, Marsh does not end up much better. Cope's attack on him eventually has the effect that Cope wanted it to have. There's also an economic collapse that kind of gets a lot of people saying, why are we spending so much money on these bones? But between the bad press and the economic collapse, Marsh is removed from the head of the U.S. Geological Survey, and he lives out the rest of his days in relative poverty. He ends up going to Yale, hat in hand, saying, can I please have a salary so I don't, like, starve?
I shouldn't be laughing at that. It was just the way you said it.
Well, I mean, he was nasty for a lot of his life, so we can be glad a little bit that maybe he's getting his comeuppance. Eventually, Cope dies. In 1897, he passes away, I believe from some pneumonia that he catches from being out in the rain, and you'd think that would be over. You would think that the Bone Wars would finally be at their end. There's nothing more that Cope can do to strike out at Marsh. Marsh is left standing. But no. In his death, Cope is still competing because he has his body donated to science so that he can have his brain measured and compared to Marsh's when Marsh dies so that he can prove that his brain was bigger than Marsh's brain. Unfortunately, when Marsh dies in 1899, 2 years later, he does not take Cope up on the challenge. His body is just buried, and we don't know who had the bigger head. I don't know that it matters, Tony.
I was going to say both of the egos were enormous, at least.
In the end, Marsh won the Bone Wars. If you are keeping tally by how many animals each of these men named, and believe me, they were keeping tally, he named 87 new species, while Cope only discovered 56. And this wasn't necessarily because of Cope's lack of skill, but more because, especially toward the end there, Marsh just had so many more resources at his disposal that he could just do a lot more work of actually classifying things, whereas Cope was out in the field with not much money, doing his own digging, trying to fit things together, again, having bones stolen out from under him by Marsh. He just never was able to quite catch up, especially once Marsh had the support of Yale and Cope was basically on his own. If you've heard of these two men, one of the most famous discoveries that you will have heard of is the discovery of the Apatosaurus. And Cope uncovered the Apatosaurus and published his findings about it. And then Marsh discovered another dinosaur, or what he thought was another dinosaur, called the Brontosaurus, and published his findings about it. Both men went to their graves not realizing that they had probably discovered the same dinosaur. Marsh had accidentally put the wrong head on what scientists now believe was an Apatosaurus skeleton and essentially just named the same dinosaur that Cope named. But even in death, the Brontosaurus name had more staying power than the Apatosaurus name, and in 2015, a new variant of sauropod was discovered that scientists transferred the name Brontosaurus to. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, we have the Brontosaurus once again. It is a real dinosaur. You're not using fake paleontology if you talk about the Brontosaurus.
I always like that they fixed that.
Yes. So, the bad idea here, I think, is letting the competition get in the way of the science. It's understandable how this devolved into the petty letter-writing match that it became, but ultimately I think it did more harm than good for the field of paleontology. There's certainly room for friendly competition between researchers, but the extent that these guys took it to, no doubt, first of all, ended up actually harming dinosaur bones, right? Because they were both blowing them up by the end of their careers. And also, in Marsh's case, having fake things published just to make his rival look bad, which just muddies the water. But also, it kind of cast a pall on paleontology for a while after that. The nastiness of this dispute ended up spilling over into the public consciousness, and it really kind of made paleontologists sort of ashamed to lift their head very high for a little bit until eventually, obviously, the field was revived. But they did a lot of things that set paleontology forward, but they also did many things that set it backwards. And if they could have just set aside a little bit more of their differences, not got along and worked together, but maybe not try to blow each other up in literal and figurative senses, things might have been better for dinosaur discoveries throughout the years.
Yep, and we might have some other species we didn't know about.
We might, but we never will know because they blew them up, Tony. Anyway, that's it for this week. I really appreciate you guys listening. If you like this, don't forget to tell a friend about us. If you want to support the work that we do here, and it is quite a bit of work. I've been reading several books this week and listening to some stuff that other people recorded about this topic. You can go over to patreon.com/humanechoes and just throw us a couple bucks. It really means a lot for those of you who already do it. We really appreciate you. And we will see you guys next week with another episode of Bad Ideas. Bye, guys.
Bye.